you're looking for work in the tech industry, you have come to the right place. In this video, I'm going to share with you 10 steps, tips, tricks, whatever you want to call them, to ensure that you have the best possible shot at getting that amazing job. Before we start though, if you're not looking for a job but are just curious, you should always be interviewing. It's okay, take the interview. This is something that's not completely obvious for people. Interviewing is one of the best ways to network. How else can you get in the door at a company, sit and talk about yourself for an hour? They'll remember you, even if no job comes of it. What's more, the people that interview you will remember you when they move on to other positions at other companies. The last 5 interviews I've done have been through referrals or managers reaching out to me because a role came up that they thought I would fit well. These are the best kinds of interviews to have. They're tailor-made, they know you're coming. This is exactly how I ended up back at Microsoft after 10 years of being out on my own. A friend of mine reached out because he thought I would fit a role perfectly. I didn't want to go back. I was enjoying working on my own, but I took the interview anyway. I met the team and they were awesome, and I was given a very compelling offer, so I accepted, much to my surprise. Alright, so let's start here with tip number 1, you and your outlook on what's happening. If you're actively looking for work, you're probably a little bit anxious. It's understandable, especially if you've been laid off. And if that's the case, or if you think it's about to happen, know that you're not alone. It has nothing to do with you. Layoffs happen in this industry, and they always will. And it's usually a case of timing and luck, bad luck, and this was your time. There is a natural economic cycle that companies lean on to trim their workforce, which usually overexpands when the economy is good. One company announces layoffs, and you can be damn sure more big announcements are on the way from other companies looking to do the same thing. These tech companies overhire, mostly because they can. They have the money, so why not? More than that, firing people, at least in the US, is very difficult, unless there's a threat of an economic downturn. Then you can fire people all you like, for some reason. Look, I'm not saying this practice is okay. I'm saying it's the way it is, for now. Reading the headlines, however, might not exactly reflect what's going on in our industry. Big tech companies just laid off tens of thousands of employees, but believe it or not, there is still a gigantic demand for good people. The tech industry is booming. It will always be booming. Here's a table from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US of job postings. There were millions of postings, which only declined from December 2022, which was the big month of layoffs, by 1,600 total listings. Programming job postings actually went up by 1,700 jobs. That brings it to almost 74,000 jobs available. It's easy to think our economy's in the tank, the tech industry is imploding, and our jobs will be replaced by AI zombies because these headlines get the clicks. The reality is completely different, however. There is still, and likely will be for a very long time, a lot of work. This headline is from February of 2023, the same month Google and Microsoft laid off tens of thousands of employees. Make of it what you will. Tons of jobs. Unemployment is near the lowest it's been in decades. Deep breath. You're going to find the job you want. There are jobs out there. Next up, tip number 2. We need to frame this process in a positive light. We all understand that tech interviews are challenging. They can be downright infuriating. But consider this. Your interviewer was sitting where you are at some point in the past. They are quite literally just like you and will be possibly working with you every single day. They're not an abstract representation of the company that you're going to be interviewing with. They're people. It's easy to see them as gatekeepers with the keys to let you in. People judging what you know and who you are. But in most cases, they aren't. They are there to ask you questions, score your answers, and that's it. You're a random person that they have never met, and they have 60 or so minutes to assess what you know. They likely can't hire you on the spot, so instead they're grading your responses. They've probably done this with hundreds of people. You're just one of them. Talking to people isn't easy, and you want to work with them. Don't forget that. They don't know who you are. If you're applying to a big company, it might take a few times to get in. It's a relationship that you're building over time, just like meeting a new group of friends, and who knows, maybe that'll be the case. If you get turned down, just know that this could be one of many times that it takes you to get into a company, and it's totally normal. All right, let's move on to tip number 3, investing in help. And this one, I hope, is obvious. Tech interviews are silly, but necessary, and they're kind of a game. You need to understand the rules of that game if you're going to get hired. I have a number of resources for you at bigmachine.io, including a 5.5-hour video course I made with my friend John Skeet, who's the #1 ranked user at Stack Overflow. He works at Google and does 5 videos with me, showing me how he thinks about these questions and offering different bits of advice. I also sell the Imposter's Handbook, what I like to call a CS primer for self-taught developers, which could help you with the basics if you need. Another favorite resource of mine is Interview Cake, and I can't say enough good things about this site. It's all about practicing algorithmic questions so you recognize the patterns to get through just about any question. Here's a typical one, dealing with arrays. You can do this yourself in your own editor, of course, or you can use theirs that comes preloaded with unit tests. How cool is that? I'm using JavaScript here, but you can also use Python, Ruby, C#, Java, PHP, Swift, even C. Now, it's not free, but that's a good thing. They put a ton of effort into this site. If it was free, who knows what you'd get? This is a great resource and worth the investment. Now, I know spending money when you're looking for work can be really uncomfortable, but as I mentioned, it's an investment that will pay off. You will find work sooner, and ideally find a better job. It is worth your time and effort. All right, tip number 4, job descriptions. They can read like copy and paste nonsense, and yeah, in some cases they are, but in most cases they're not. Employers will often spend time on these descriptions because they have to. The more detailed a description is, the more structured the interview can be. Point is, even if the description seems inhuman and formulaic, read it and know it. You're going to be asked about it, and the last thing you want to hear from them is, well, that's not really what this role is about. The main reason you need to read the description carefully is because you want to have an answer for what interests you about this role. What interests you about this company? And they're going to ask you these questions. You want to have a ready answer. Here's a listing for a security program manager at AWS, a company that uses structural interviewing. By reading this description carefully and studying the AWS interview process, I can already guess the types of questions that I'm going to be asked. More importantly, I can begin to frame the answers that I'll provide, assuming that I think this job will be a good fit for me, focusing on collaboration, small, agile teams, and contractor management. The second paragraph here tells me that they want a creative mind that's self-motivated. It's a pretty well-written job description. All right, tip number 5. You got the call. Good job. This means that your resume stood out and they're interested in your skills. If you choose to move forward, your first task is to understand what the hiring process looks like. And they're going to tell you that. If you're applying to a larger company, you'll have a recruiter whose sole job is to get you through this process. The more they prepare you, the more they get paid when you get hired. They're there to help you, so lean on them. They're probably going to tell you that the first call will be with a screener, and these are usually shorter calls from 30 to 45 minutes and are general in nature. You might be asked some lightweight questions about your background and why you want to work at Company X. You might also get thrown a simple technical question too. Your recruiter is going to know all of this, so make sure you ask. In a recent interview, my screener asked me about Postgres as I highlighted Postgres in my objectives and skill summary on my resume. The specific question was, how do you know when you need an index? And how do you choose one? Now, there's a lot I could read into that question. Did she just Google this about Postgres? Did she know the answer? Was she a Postgres expert? And it turns out, yes, she was a Postgres expert. And yes, she knew the answer. It didn't matter. I answered it completely and I made it through the interview. I know a lot about Postgres. It's kind of my jam. Next thing to find out is if your interview is going to be a structured one. Many tech companies are switching to structured interviews because studies have shown that bias is extremely reduced. These questions, despite seeming more subjective, are being used to assess a candidate's technical abilities. You're asked to describe work that you have done, getting into as much detail as you can. There might be follow-ups, but these are usually clarifications. Given that the questions are structured, so should your answer be. Amazon suggests the STAR method. Describe a situation, a task, your answer, and the result. That works pretty well, but I like a little more detail in there, so I came up with a Spizzle method, let's call it that, where you describe a situation as succinctly as you can. You outline the problem that you encountered. You describe your solution to the problem, the impact of your solution, and the lessons that you learned. Now, this should take about 5 minutes total, keeping with the rule of 5s here. At the very most, 10 minutes. You want to be brief, you want to be succinct and concise. They're going to grade you on this and the quality of your answer. So here's a question that you're almost sure to get if you're going for a structured interview. Tell me about a time that you failed. I hate this question, but I've been asked it so many times. Here's what my answer might look like, if we're talking about Postgres, that is. I actually haven't failed with Postgres. It's why I love it so much. I don't know why. It's kind of weird. I've failed with so many things, but Postgres, for some reason, has always had my back. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's standards compliance. It keeps you from inflicting so much self-pain. Who knows? I did, however, fail pretty hard with MySQL, which is how I ended up working with Postgres. So right here is a pivot. So you want to make sure you tell that to your interviewer, and you can say, well, I failed with MySQL. Should I tell you about that? And they'll probably say, sure, go ahead. So now you get to hear my story. It was 2010, and I was working with Ruby on Rails, which I used to power my business, techpub.com. And we had been using MongoDB up until that point, and wanted to use a relational database moving forward because we'd read about Mongo's data problems, so we decided to move everything over to MySQL. I know relational databases very well. It's a little bit new to MySQL, but I decided to let Ruby on Rails migration functionality handle the creation of the tables and the DDL, data definition language, which ended up being a bad idea because I reversed the length and precision of the decimal column representing the order total. Instead of a length of 10 and a precision of 2, I had a length of 2 and a precision of 10. Unfortunately, the default settings in MySQL try to be helpful, and they actually coerce the data to fit the column constraints. The solution to this problem was thankfully immediate. I ran another migration to change the length and precision, and I also ran an update by hand to change the wrong order values. The impact was minimal on the business, thankfully. I was completely transparent with my customers, and they were grateful for that. However, internally, we decided easily that MySQL was gone. We can't trust a database that will change data for you. That's not being helpful. That's just being incorrect. So the lesson that I learned was straightforward. I know how to test software, and I didn't have proper testing in place. I spot-checked the data and test migrations just to make sure everything was right, of course, but I didn't include orders over $100, which is what led to the problem. I spent a month learning Postgres, which is notorious for being a stickler for rules, and we moved shortly thereafter, after I felt comfortable in the system. It's been humming along for me ever since, and it's the best technical choice I've made. That's my answer. That's a little under 5 minutes, but in an interview setting, I might go into some more details, and the interviewer might also ask you for a few more details. If you're interviewing with a medium to larger size company, you're likely to go through what's called a loop. It's a set of 4 to 5 interviews, all usually in a row, sometimes with a break between. They could be structured interviews, or they could just be a little bit more freeform, or a progressive loop, which is what Microsoft does. And at the end of each interview in Microsoft, they can no-hire you if you want, and if you get 2 no-hires, you are out the door, and the day is done. Loops generally take the better part of a single day and are mentally exhausting. You'll often be given a break, but don't count on it. Sometimes they rapid-fire you and shrug, saying they had no choice. Get a good night's sleep. Make sure you're in a quiet place. If you're a member of a co-working space, reserve the conference room for the call times, and make sure you bring your lunch with you. If you don't have access to a co-working space, you can always pay for daily access, including the use of a small conference room. Do not do this in a cafe. It'll be too loud, you'll have Wi-Fi problems, and it's going to be distracting for the people talking to you. Instead of a structured interview, you might also get a take-home assignment. Many companies, including GitHub, use these exercises instead of a shorter interview. The idea here is that you're given time to show your stuff, if you will, using a real-world scenario and ideally without the pressure of an interview setting. Here's an example that I found on GitHub. It's not from GitHub, the company. It's just a random company who has their interview questions, their take-home questions, public. And I think this is the kind of thing you can probably expect. It also highlights one of the major reasons I dislike take-home tests like this. They're really only as good as the person asking, and I suppose that's true for any interview question. But if you're one-on-one, then you have a dialogue, and you can say what you're thinking about the question. Here, it's all code. You take it home, and you see some instructions that are confusing, like this. Using an I like query when you have well-defined values like roles? Ew. This is something that would drive a DBA nuts. Now, maybe this is a trick question. Not sure. I can tell you that an in query would be much better than using an I like, and this would create a conflict situation. Something I'd have to explain, which is fine, I suppose. Could be intentional, but I would be feeling weird about it as I'm writing my solution to this answer. Next, querying by compensation and gender. Ew, let's say that's a pretty volatile interview question. I think it's a very important topic, don't get me wrong, but it's not the subject of a technical interview question. Overall, this question right here is a bit off the mark and to me doesn't represent the company very well. So you can see why these technical questions, they leave a little bit to be desired often. So as you can tell, I don't like take-home assignments. They make sure to tell you not to spend too much time on it, but let's face it, if you need work, you're going to. I would probably spend an hour on the initial solution and then take a 30 to 60 minute break, going over things in my head. I would then go for round 2 and likely just do it all over from scratch, just to see if there's another way I didn't think about. I might study what others have done as well. If you're doing a front-end assignment, you might go out and look at interface designs to see a good style or pull in some ready-made CSS to make things look nice. The point is, it's a lot of damn time for an interview, and I think it's a bit much to ask people to go through this. It feels arrogant to me, unless the problem is really focused. Now, being positive, coding is fun, and if you enjoy small challenges, this could be a fun way to carry out an interview. The trick is to manage your own perfectionism, and if you don't think you can, be honest with your recruiter or your interviewer. If the practice does stress you out, tell them. Companies do review their hiring practices often, and you never know. They might stop doing take-home assignments and invite you back if you left a positive impression. Another type of interview that you might get is a pair coding interview. One of the more constructive interviews that I've been through is using pair coding. When done correctly, it's fun, extremely efficient. With pair coding, one person writes the code while the other watches and makes suggestions, corrections, observations, and so on. These interviews are usually problem-oriented, where you have to debug, refactor, otherwise fix something that isn't working. They're usually small problems and come from real-world issues someone at the company has faced. I like these interviews because they're a slice of what it would be like to work at the company with the people that you're going to be working with. You're not tasked with some silly algorithmic nonsense, and you, as a candidate, get a great feel for the technical capabilities of the company. One thing to watch out for, however, is when you feel your skills don't align with that of the interviewer, and this can happen often. Either they have more experience than you or the other way around. People have different levels of skills, and their chances that your problem solving and solution will align is actually pretty low. As the candidate, you might feel like you should do whatever the interviewer suggests, which is part of their role in the pair, but if you know a better way to do something, you're going to have to challenge them. Situations like this can easily lead to conflict, which is okay in this setting and why people like doing these interviews. They want to see how you handle yourself. If you have a good interviewer, this should go smoothly. If your interviewer is busy, stressed out, or just new to interviewing, these kinds of things can be a little bit difficult. Moving on to tip number 6, technical preparation. If you're a great test taker and have natural recall, then you can probably skip over this part. If you're like me, however, you will probably need to prepare yourself technically for your interview. The best thing you can do to prepare for your interview, technically speaking, is to focus on the words that you're going to use. Speaking and coding are entirely different things. You might know, for instance, how to use a local variable to store the values calculated in a loop, but do you know what memoization is and the basics of dynamic programming? When you answer an interview question, you need to have the words to do so. I had an interview where I was asked how Docker worked, and my brain was so fogged from the long day of loop interviews that I couldn't put the words together very well. I felt like oatmeal was just clogging my brain. The idea here is to focus on 10 terms a day, either learning or relearning them, and see if they connect to other ideas, and if they do, explore those. Let's go back to this database question that I discussed earlier. If I was asked what my objection is about iLike, I would reply that a case-sensitive wildcard operation isn't needed for looking up something that can use constraints and keys. Using an in operator would be much more reliable because it's using the relational design to guarantee the results, whereas a fuzzy search only guarantees a text match. Now, I know these words because I know databases, but I've also taken the time to be sure that I know the difference between an operator, a predicate, constraint, and fuzzy search. 10 words pertaining to the job that you're applying for. Write them down in a notes app if you're choosing. Build your vocabulary. All right, moving on to more preparation. If you're a coder, even if you're not, actually, and just work with computers, learning about space and time and complexity can vastly improve your chances. And yes, I am talking about big O and its counterpart, big theta. These concepts aren't just for interviews, believe it or not. And hey, let's go back to this question. Why not? As a former DBA, if I see I like in the logs for an application, I'm going to have a cow. And I'm going to start scheduling some one-on-ones with the dev team. And why, you ask? I can answer you in two ways. The first is to say that a text comparison query like this can and often does ignore indexing. Indexes that I've optimized for the table to avoid full table reads that soak up system resources. Another way to put that is that I like is most likely to be order n versus another query that would use my index, which would be log n. Well, not every time. It's possible to do an I like with an index. That's fine. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's time to learn, and it's easy to learn. Big O is a shorthand way of mathematically explaining what an operation is doing. A sequential scan, which is what we're looking at here, in a database is evaluating every single row of data, trying out our where clause, in this case looking for a specific title. The number of actual rows don't matter. All we care about is that this operation is happening on every single one of them. So we just say for n rows of data, we have one operation. Or our comparison here is on the order of one operation per n inputs, or just order n. Using an index, however, the database does things differently. It creates a sorted list, the index, in memory, and uses it to logarithmically split things in half, which is a form of binary search, until it finds the value that you want. That splitting in half is a logarithmic operation, so we say it's log n. What does this mean? If we have 1,000 rows of data, we do 1,000 operations. If we use an index, however, we do 10 operations, and rounding up. That might not seem all that impressive, but consider 1 million rows of data. That's 20 total operations. 1 billion rows of data is just 30 operations. You can see why indexing is important, I hope. It comes down to scaling. When you start researching these things, you find that log n operations are extremely popular optimizations, usually done on n operations like loop stuff. Here's a small test to get you ready. Here we have some code that removes duplicates from an array. If I was asked by an interviewer what the problems were with this code, I could respond that running a loop within a loop is probably overkill, and you could do the same thing with variables as caches. Or I could say that this algorithm is n squared, and we can get it down to n using dynamic programming and memoization. If the list was sorted, we can get it down to log n. As I mentioned, I could spend hours on this topic alone, but I won't because I already have. If you're interested, this is a book I wrote, now in its second edition, that goes into core CS topics, including Big O. Okay, to round this section out, you're going to want to be sure that you increase your vocabulary when it comes to data structures and algorithms. There are fundamental ways of storing data and doing stuff with it when it comes to computer science, and you should know the basics. Redis is a great example of why you need to know data structures and their properties. Here are the core structures in Redis. Do you know what makes them different from one another? Lists in Redis are built like linked lists, but act like a stack and a queue at the same time. Same with arrays in JavaScript, believe it or not. A hash in Redis is like a hash or straight-up object in JavaScript. We like hashes because they make looking up a single value by key extremely fast and easy. Another way to say that is a hash is order one operation to find the value that you're looking for. These are core data structures in computer science and are intimately related to space and time complexity. Knowing the differences is extremely helpful in an interview setting, also when you're using Redis and you want to know what the data structures act like in Redis versus what you know from computer science. This is especially true when it comes to binary trees. For some reason, interviews love these things. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that you should study tree traversal in depth and make sure you know how it's done and can write it out without difficulty. It's fun to do these things, believe it or not, and you're going to learn a ton. I've been through the interview loop at Google 3 times. The first 2 times I was there, it took me along the engineering track. In those 2 interview loops, I was asked to do a tree problem twice. If you're not paracoding or taking something home, be ready for a tree problem. Onward to tip number 7. If you have some experience, you're likely going to face one or more systems design questions. These are open-ended, discussion-oriented questions where you and your interviewer explore a topic together. It's critical to understand that there is no right answer, only your judgment with what you're being asked. And these questions aren't always purely technical. Let me give you an example. Here's a classic systems design question. Design a URL shortener. Notice that it's very terse and without much detail, which is entirely the point. You get to play lead developer and start asking questions, and based on your questions, your interviewer will steer you in a given direction. Here's one that's similar to a question that I was asked at Google once, something a bit more challenging than a URL shortener. Your first reaction might be one of complete overwhelm, but just remember, there's a formula and a strategy here, which is, in short, take your time answering. You have a whole hour. Write things down. Sketch them out if you need to. Ask every single question you can think of to clarify what it is you're being asked to design. Keep writing things down. Talk out loud as you ponder your notes, and it helps your interviewer understand your thought process. There you go. Screenshot this. The questions you ask tell the interviewer a lot about your experience and your focus. Here are a few types of questions I asked my Google interviewer, the first being privacy, and then confirming after they've said, yes, of course, we're thinking about privacy, but are we really? It's important to double check yourself. You might think you're handling privacy just fine, but other people spot checking you is important. The next set of questions narrows the problem as much as possible. I don't do hardware, so let's be sure that I don't have to do hardware. I can push this further by asking if we're dealing with a cloud-based thing that might have to work offline at times, or is it completely offline to begin with? This might seem a bit silly in this day and age of connected everything, but these venues can be pretty sensitive to outside connectivity. Finally, the system, as described, only works for people with decent eyesight. What are the plans for accessibility here? The best way to prepare for these interviews is to practice out loud and apply a framework to your answers. There is no right answer, but you do need to demonstrate your design skills. Here's a simple process that you can use, starting with the most critical element, which is to ask questions and clarify things. It's an immediate red flag in an interview if you jump right in and try to solve everything. Assess the risks, then restate the goal of the system with clarity once the risk is understood. For the details, break the system into parts. User experience, such as using a big front-end framework like Next or going strictly mobile. Back-end architecture and a scaling plan. Maybe a monolith would do. Or you might need concurrency with microservices. You'll probably need a server or two, so talk about what that would look like. In other words, DevOps stuff. Your build process, traffic monitoring, uptime, lots to talk about here. Finally, data storage and protection. Security is a huge concern. What measures will you take to protect your company data and that of your users? Of course, all of this needs to pertain to the risks and clarifications you discussed in the beginning. I know, right? This, friendo, is why we practice. If you need to, rewind a few minutes and make yourself a framework. Screenshot what I just put up and use that as your answer guideline. If you know what you need to say, then saying it is just a matter of filling in the blanks. You can get through this. Practice will absolutely help. Here's a tip. Go for a drive by yourself 2 to 3 times a week before your interview, and ideally make it a 45 to an hour long drive to a fun destination of some kind, a place that's a treat to visit. On your phone, Google the term example systems design questions right before you go, but don't look at the question. When you get in your car and turn on the engine, glance at your phone quickly and read a random one, first one, middle one, whatever. Pretend you were just asked that question. No changing. The point is to be uncomfortable. If you don't know the answer, think about it. Pretend you're in the interview setting and that you have to answer it anyway. During your drive, answer the question out loud, being sure to use the framework that you've prepared for yourself based on the slides that I just presented you. When you get to where you're going, hopefully you're done, hopefully you've timed it right, chill out a little bit, walk around, think about how you did, enjoy where you are, relax a bit, empty your brain. Now you got to go home, do it all over again. You can do this, it just requires practice. All right, tip number 8. It's always fun to share interview horror stories, isn't it? Like the time that I threatened my interviewer with a lawsuit, or when my interviewer realized 10 minutes in that they had the wrong resume. These things happen. It's never fun. If it does happen to you, here are some ideas on what can help you get through these crappy situations. First, always understand that you are interviewing the company as much as they are interviewing you. They take notes about you. You should take notes about them. Most interviewers will explain to you that they're listening to you, but they also need to write things down. And hey, you get to do the exact same thing. These notes should include the time, the date, the name of the person you're talking to, the questions they ask, as many things as you can possibly pop in there. You will interview with the same company repeatedly. Having notes on your previous interviews is golden. Your future self might be considering applying to a given company for the second, third, fourth, fifth time. Knowing what went down in the first set of interviews will be invaluable to you, especially if you can squeeze the recruiter for some help. A lot of times they have access to information and they will, on the side, let you know what happened. Writing notes is powerful, especially if your interviewer says something that you sense is off base. Borderline insulting, or I hate to say, possibly illegal. It happens. When these things do happen, you should make sure you clarify what you heard and then write it down. This means, of course, that you need to know what's okay to ask and what's not. Personal questions are, for the most part, off limits. Now, you can be asked diversity and inclusion questions, culture fit questions, which we're going to get to in a bit, but in general, your personal details can't be used to evaluate you for a position. Questions like, how old are you again? And did you say you were married? Where are you from originally? Ugh, that happened to a friend of mine. If this does happen, ask them to repeat the question. Write it down and see if you can rescue the situation. There might be a reason they're asking you personal questions. That's very relevant to the job. So be sure you give them the chance to explain. If they don't have an explanation, write that down too and ask to move on to the next question. It's important to keep your composure during this time because you could be wrong. Maybe the question they asked actually does pertain. If you're completely over it, though, you can always leave. It's important to realize that the person you're talking to is just one person. They're not the entire company. It's hard to gauge whether the poor interview is a systemic thing or just a random occurrence. Use your best judgment, but I always like to err on the side of don't assume malice over ignorance. Sometimes interviewers just back themselves into a corner for no good reason at all. I interviewed with the same company 3 times over the years, and in 2 of those interview loops, I had to deal with someone who clearly had a lot on their mind. The first showed up to my interview with a burrito and said, "It's lunchtime here in New York. I hope you don't mind." That's rude. They ate the burrito during the entire time of the interview. The second time around, my interviewer was 10 minutes late and told me the big company conference was coming up and they had a lot to do, so they might need to cut things short. He then picked up my resume for the very first time and asked me about work I did 12 years ago that did not pertain to the job I was applying to. You will get an interview like this at some point. Handling it properly is a challenge. I made the mistake of not rescheduling the interviews with Burrito Boy and Mr. Tardy. If you're interviewing with a larger company, they'll be using a recruiter to help you through this process and make sure you understand the rules of engagement before you go in. Your recruiter will likely tell you, if you have any issues at all, call me immediately, and give you their phone number. Make sure you know to use it. A polite way of backing out of an interview with a distracted person is just to do exactly that. I can see you're extremely busy and this position is important to me, so I'm going to ask that we reschedule. That's a phrase that'll work perfectly. Be sure to write down the details. Tip number 9, personal values questions. More and more tech companies are adopting cultural codes of conduct, making diversity and inclusion a priority. You will likely be asked a few questions that I like to call personal values questions, but are also referred to as cultural fit, D&I. These can be tricky. Here are variations of 2 questions you're likely to be asked. How has diversity and inclusion improved your work life, or your life in general, and the things that you've done to promote diversity and inclusion in your workplace? Given that our world is getting closer together and people from all walks of life are working together more than ever before, these are good questions to ask. Your prospective company will want to know whether you value diversity as it will impact your colleagues. On the other hand, diversity is subjective, and an interview question that's based on subjective answer is only as relevant and meaningful as the person asking it. I'm a straight white man, and if I'm interviewing a black trans person about their views on diversity, what's expected in that answer? And flip that around. A black trans person asked me the same question in an interview. How is my answer going to be evaluated? Here's a quote farther down the article that I reference, and the emphasis is mine. I appreciate this point of view. I absolutely agree that my answers will be unlike many of my friends' answers. Many aren't like me and don't share my life experiences, so what does that mean in terms of expressing my thoughts on diversity and who's hearing it? Now, I can't help you here other than to say you need to be as honest as possible and know the questions are asked in good faith. As discussed before, you can't be denied employment for any of these reasons, which makes denying someone a position after a cultural interview a little bit tricky. I was denied a role once the day after a culture fit interview with a black woman and an older white man. We discussed a wide range of topics and I received my rejection first thing the next day. It didn't feel good. And yes, I wondered if I didn't answer well. I like to think I'm a good person. I've learned a lot. But maybe they didn't think that? I'll never know. These companies don't offer you reasons for rejection, typically to avoid lawsuits. All right, well, I hope you've made it this far. The last bit is critical. Make sure you come with questions ready to ask. Most interviewers don't. That's a mistake. First reason that you want to do this is to make it very clear, as I've been saying, that you are also interviewing them. Even if you desperately need a job, you never want them to know that. You're hot stuff. You're waiting on at least 2 other offers. That you decided to take this interview out of curiosity. It's possible to take nonchalance a bit too far, of course. So well thought out questions also serve to show respect for the company that you're interviewing with. Like you've thought about working there and naturally are curious about how things work. What are those things? It's tough to come up with questions on the spot. So once again, take some notes, screenshot if you have to. I have a good list for you, ready to go. You want to succeed in your position, and this means having a mentor you can bounce things off of. A mentor can be your boss, but it's usually someone senior to you that's been at the company for a while. Many companies have formalized this, but most of the time it's a casual thing. If they say no or it's up to you to figure things out, that's a red flag. They should care about your advancement within the company and have a ready answer. Here are a bunch of other questions that you can ask your prospective company. And they're all based on the idea that what if you could interview your current job, knowing what you know now? Get in a time machine, go back in time, ask questions to avoid any weirdnesses, or perhaps spot any things that are making you want to leave the company. What would you have asked back then? You want to deliver value at your job. You want to succeed. You want to ship things. So what is your company going to do to help you out? You can't go it alone. So what are they going to do to help you succeed? Find out. How often do you get to meet with your boss? Just you two? Do they offer skill training? Maybe can you go to a conference or two? How will people know when you kick ass? You get the idea. Screenshot this. You want to make sure you ask these questions and get clear on communication and your progress track in your next job. All right, well, that's it for me. Thanks so much for watching. I do wish you luck and hope you get your job that you like. And I hope that these tips have been helpful for you. Thanks again.